skills that made relationships work, communication, clarity, trust, understanding people, are the same skills that build successful businesses and meaningful careers. Maybe your biggest advantage isn't what you know, but it's how well you connect. Today we're talking about how personal growth, relationships, and entrepreneurship are more connected than most of us realize, and how something as simple as writing a book can become a powerful catalyst for all three. I'm joined by Dr. Lee, a relationship expert, coach, speaker, and author who has spent more than 30 years studying how people move from feeling truly stuck to truly thriving. His books and writing didn't just share ideas. They became the foundation of a coaching and consulting business built around helping people create lasting change in both their lives and relationships. In this episode, we're exploring how relationship skills can translate into business success, how authors and creators can turn a book into a platform and an opportunity, and the practical steps anyone can take to build something meaningful, both professionally and personally. Lee, welcome to the show. Dr. Lee, welcome to the show. To start us off, can you share a little bit about your background and the work that you do today, and what originally drew you to helping people thrive in their relationships and lives?
Yeah, so I was trained as a therapist, and in the midst, and really at the end of that, I read an article. I was writing my dissertation, read an article about coaching. So that's what I do, and began to claim that title over the years. And one of the things that I was discouraged with was the effectiveness of really marriage therapy. And so I wrote a book that was kind of me saying this is what I think is a better approach. And that led to a program online back in 1999. The secondary interest was how do people build resilience and how do they thrive? So I've done a lot of research on that, wrote several books on that. Those books actually ended up being the cornerstone of my business. And that led to me working with authors and creators who were trying to find a way of taking their book and turning it into a business like I had done. I still do the relationship work, and I still help people thrive, and I also help authors to build their business from what they've created.
You've often described your health scare as a major turning point. How did this experience reshape your perspective, both personally and professionally?
So I was in my mid-30s and realized that while I was studying a lot about how people build resilience and actually learn to thrive, I wasn't practicing a lot of what I was learning. And so I was stressed out, not resting well, not eating well, not getting exercise, and my body kind of let me know. I went through it was a period actually when I was creating a video program, a lot of filming, and that led to this health scare. I don't go into what that is because there are a lot of people who will not have the outcome I did, and I just don't want to put it out there. But I had an acute version of what this chronic thing is, but they didn't realize it. It's rare enough that the doctors had never seen the acute condition. So they call my wife and tell her that this will lead to disability, and eventually the effects of it could kill me. So when I finally found it was the acute version, I had a doctor who said, I can't make you feel better. The good news is you'll recover. So we went through 8-9 months of me being fairly sick, 3 or 4 months of very sick, and then several months more of recovery. And I kind of realized that I had to do a lot of changes in my own life on how to thrive. But it also brought home the fact that we've only got so much time. No matter what, we've only got so much time. And so how did I want to spend it? Do I want to be focused on maybe where things are tough or where things are possible? And so I have a core belief. I did then too, but I live it out now, that we're here to leave the world better than we found it. And if that is about helping people, helping them thrive, or helping them to have a better marriage, or helping them to build a business, that's what it led to.
Thank you for sharing that with us. It's come up quite a bit lately on the show, is that people tend to prioritize what they're growing over their own personal health, and they can forget that sometimes. I think often we get so wrapped up in a project or an idea or a business, and everything kind of revolves around that. And different areas of your life can take a back seat. For example, maybe your health or also relationships. So I want to talk about that a little bit too. You spent decades studying relationships, and what's one relationship skill that maybe has a direct impact on someone's career or business success that people overlook? Because I think the two are a lot more closely intertwined than many of us realize.
Yeah, so relationships are everything, right? I mean, if you're building a business, that's through relationships with other people. If you're building a marriage, it's through the relationship there. So you're right, everything boils down to that. There is a longitudinal study, it's the longest one we have, on what leads to people, A, having happy lives, and B, having long lives. And it is all about the relationships they have. So that going back to the beginning of my career, I was working as a chaplain. And it was interesting because I never had conversations with anyone telling me they wish they had spent more time at work, more time on a project, more time doing, but more time relating. That was the regret. They didn't spend more time relating. And that is certainly true for entrepreneurs and business owners, creators. You can get so caught up in the specifics of that and miss the fact that those are relational pieces at their core, and you don't work on the relationships. So you're right. Relationships are relationships. There can be different versions. What I put into my marriage, connecting in different ways, is different than I would with somebody else, but it's still the core of the connection. And if we think about our connection skills, that is a big one I think a lot of people miss of how do I attend to the relationships around me, period. How do I make sure that I'm prioritizing the relationships that make sense? I want to go back just for a little bit though. You talked about how often people disregard their own stuff while they're doing all this building. I tend to think that most people miss the fact that they are the biggest tool they have in their relationship, in their business, whatever they're doing. And if you don't take care of a tool, we know what happens. If you're just tossing aside whatever tools you have at home, they'll rust and rot, and that's the end of it. Right. Same with us. If we are too taxing on our body, we can't be the best tool, whether it's at home or at work.
That's a great point. We all kind of know it subconsciously that we'll take care of ourselves. We'll get to it. We'll work on that later. And then, or, we make time. Maybe it's to go to the gym, or maybe it is to work out or eat clean. But that's only one small area of taking care of yourself. I mean, it's very easy to kind of overwhelm yourself or to get ahead of yourself on so many tasks. We talk a lot about outsourcing different projects on the show too, because we kind of want to oversee everything, especially with some people that tend to be more entrepreneurial. So it's a really interesting topic that I think needs to be brought up more, especially as we're involved so much digitally. And I think that relates to the relationships that you brought up, right? So yes, I think you have your community online, so whatever you're trying to grow there. But I think people forget about adding that extra personal touch to that too. Connecting with your audience doesn't necessarily have to be like a viral piece of content. If you had, 20 people that actually really care about what you're posting, I think that goes such a longer way, and it helps to kind of further the any sort of business relationships or anything that you would get from that audience in the future. So there's so many ways to think about relationships in business, and I really appreciate how you added your insight into that.
Let me just, before you go on, let me just point to one of the mindsets that I think is important in what you just said. A lot of people go, how can I make this go viral? And my thing is always, who's that one person? I don't even go with 20 people. When I'm writing, I imagine that one person sitting across from me that is having a difficulty. I'm trying to talk to that person through the writing. If I'm doing a video, I'm talking to that one person. If I'm doing a podcast, it's to one person. And when we do that, then it comes across as not, I hear people are like, oh, you all out there? And I'm like, there's one person listening. That's not what they're aware of. They're focused on what they have. When we focus on that one person, first, they feel it. And second, we don't get so wrapped up in how do I make this like a splash. I'm trying to make a difference with that one person.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of people too often get a little bit nervous when building their own personal brands online because they feel like they have to speak to everybody, like you said. And at that point, it can be overwhelming for some people, especially talking on camera or putting themselves out there, because they envision putting it out there into everybody on the internet. But I think when you focus on just reaching your target consumer, your target audience, the person that you're trying to help, I think that really helps to take away that stress and that, that overwhelm as well too.
Yeah.
That's a really great point. So entrepreneurs tend to focus heavily on the strategy and the work, and sometimes at the expense of their own personal lives. What relationship patterns do you most often see in ambitious people? And are there any boundaries that successful entrepreneurs set that struggling ones tend to avoid?
Successful ones who are successful in life, because there are people who just are successful by grinding and grinding and grinding, but they're grinding themselves down. So people who I think one layer out of just being successful in life are the ones who make sure that they keep balance. And balance is different for different people, but making sure that you are attending to your loved ones while you're attending to business, that there's a balance that's there. So one of the problems I noticed with people in marriage, and entrepreneurs are a primary group that I see it with, is they do what I call the pause button marriage. So they establish the relationship, they fall in love, they meet this person, they do all this connecting. And then they kind of go, okay, I've got that. We've got this. So now we need to do the other things. I got to build my business, or we got to take care of the kids or whatever it is. It can be any number of them, but for entrepreneurs, got to build my business. And so they subconsciously hit the pause button because they think they've already got the relationship down. And then they start disconnecting. And the problem with that is because we as humans are such connecting creatures, we can find that in our little projects. We can find it in people in our business. And so instead of making sure we're creating that in a marriage or a committed relationship, we're finding it in our little projects. I remember talking with an entrepreneur years ago whose wife was like, I never get you. And he says, well, I've got to do the business. And I'm like, it feels to me like as you talk about that's your mistress. And that mistress is always available and always giving you positive feedback and everybody loves you there. And so, I could see the wife is just like, yep, that's it. Always on. And he finally admitted that was an inappropriate way he was relating to his business. He was getting something out of it. And I think that is a temptation if we don't focus on what really is important in our bigger relationships.
Yeah. So it seems like in situations like that, it's hard for people to silo the business or whatever project they're working on. They kind of let it take over into other aspects of their life. They're not setting those time boundaries, building into their relationships, just like they would build into a business, like making sure that they're establishing that time. Would you say that for a successful entrepreneur, what are the boundaries that they're setting? Is it taking time away from their business? Is it making sure that they take weekends off or that they spend time with their spouse after work? Like what are some of the boundaries that they can set?
Yeah, so time and attention are certainly two big ones. It's not just time, right? Because I know a lot of people who their attention is still there even if they act like they're with the family. Then so they are there but not there. And that is just as costly. So what that looks like for a person though is I think something that can vary. I know people who want to spend as much time as possible with the family, others who trim that down. And I would just say that is a conversation point to have within the family. What makes sense? Weekends, I mean, there's some entrepreneurs where most of their business is on weekends. So it's hard to say that arbitrarily. These days, I think that the bigger thing for a lot of people is figuring out how to transition since they're working at home, how to transition from business mind at home to home mind at home. And I've seen people do things like change their clothes. So they go from their work clothes to their home clothes, or go out the door and walk around their house a few times, like as if they were leaving the office and coming back in, finding something that tells their brain, I'm now home, right? And right. To have that transition. So the boundary is not just a time management piece, it's also an attention management piece and making sure that when you're doing something, that's what you're doing. If you're with the family, you're with the family. If you're with business, time to do business.
Yeah, those are some great tips. You mentioned working from home. That is hard. Sometimes it's hard for people, me included, to switch it off and to be like, okay, time to not be at work. It's also hard too with phones and everybody being easily reachable that sometimes you feel like you have to answer something because they contacted you, even though it is after work hours. So I like the idea, like you said, of creating some sort of ritual that breaks up the workday from now it's time for your home life and time to like decompress and relax and not focus on it so much. What's like one simple daily habit that couples can use to stay connected? Are there any personal habits that you'd be comfortable sharing that help keep your own relationship strong while also running your own business?
Yeah, so in my situation, we both do work at home. We both have separate home offices. And so I try to make sure that, for instance, if we don't have lunch meeting, that we're eating lunch together. And we certainly make sure that in the evening we're together, just as a focus of where am I spending my time. There is some of this that depends on how a couple talks about it. And that probably is the big thing. Do they talk about how to connect? Again, connection is it's the lifeblood of any relationship. Let me just broaden it. That is the lifeblood of every relationship. If you have a friend that you drop out of contact with, sure, you can catch up, but it loses some of the relationship. Relationships are either growing and expanding or shrinking and dying. So hit the pause button, you're shrinking it. It's in disconnection. Mm-hmm. And being attentive to that means that you ask, what does it look like for both of you? How do you negotiate that? The earlier in a relationship a couple does that, and the more they make that clear, the more likely they are to stay in connection. The less they have that conversation, and now here's the problem. Since most couples think that they've already got that down, they don't have the conversations. Okay. And that's why that pause button is so damaging. You think that you're staying connected while you are disregarding each other in many ways. And so making sure that there's some conversation. We often talk about what's going on in our lives in the evening just to make sure that we know what happened in the day. And not only what happened in the day, that's the reporting, but what that meant to us. So another distinction I would draw is I call it the difference between reporting and rapporting, like building rapport.
Right.
Reporting, how did your day go? I had 2 projects and a meeting. That's not how your day went. That's a report.
Right.
How'd your day go? I had a really tough meeting. Here's what happened. Or I had a really great meeting and here's what happened. Here's what it meant to me. That's a different level. And so I watch couples often kind of shortcut to the reports rather than making sure they're staying in that rapport zone, that connection zone.
You brought up a really interesting point too, especially about checking in with friendships. Something we're seeing a lot of lately, and I don't know if you've noticed this from some of your clients, but I think connecting as friends has changed significantly, I think, since social media. Often there's a lot of ways to look at it, but from what I've seen too, if you're someone that's consistently sharing about your life online, I think people feel like they don't need to check in as much because they think they know what's going on. So that's an interesting topic. We'd love to dive into that. And also, the conversation right now has been a lot around the friendships where you're checking in versus the friendships that you're pouring into and you maybe see weekly. There's friends that you maybe see every week and you make an effort to get together and hang out with them. Then you have friends too that are you're friends with, like you said, that checking in friendship where we'll catch up every few months, maybe once a quarter, maybe a few times a year, which, is crazy to see. But the plans kind of just get pushed down on the calendar where it's like, well, I'm busy this week. We'll catch up in a few weeks. And that connection, it is more of a report. It's more of like checking in on, well, what have you been up to? Okay, great. Here's what I've been up to. And then that kind of counts as the hangout for the friendship, which is really interesting to think about. Have you seen anything from your perspective when it comes to like the checking in unnecessary because of social media that people may feel that way, or is there a drop in that? And then also when it comes to those friendships where you're pouring into versus checking into, how do you kind of set people on the path to get them more into that like pour into mode?
Yeah, so let's go with the social media piece, because I think that all of us are aware that what people post on social media is usually not a balanced view of our life. So you're really not catching people up on your life. You're catching them up on what you want them to see of your life.
Yes, exactly.
And so there's a performative piece of that. It's not a true catch up. And I think sometimes we forget that. Like, we know the damage that's done to people when they're like, my life is nothing like that. What's wrong? And they're not seeing behind the scenes. I've had several clients who were pretty big influencers that were talking about their great life, and I was on the backside and it was falling apart. And part of it was because of that they always had to present this front enough for me to know that's a norm for people to be, I don't want to say dishonest, but creating what they want the world to see. And so that's not the check-in, which brings us to so who do you check in with? And we all do have limits of energy, of time, of attention, and to go, who is important to have in that arena of friends and connections is, I think, a fair estimation. That there's always going to be the peripheral people that, we check in once a year, once a month, whatever. And then asking the question, where are the people that we kind of feed each other, where we nurture each other? Those are the ones to pour into. When I find that all I'm doing is pouring in and not getting anything back, that's a question. I mean, is that really a relationship, a two-way relationship? And to ask the question, where are the ones that really nurture me? Because I want to prioritize those. I want to make sure that I'm nurturing and being nurtured in those relationships. And those are the ones to spend the time on.
Sometimes it just takes taking a step back and thinking about that question that you just asked. Are you always the one consistently reaching out to them? Do you feel like you're like, when you're together, when you leave the hangout, do you feel more inspired or more motivated, or how did it leave you feeling? They should want to cheer you on, but then also be there if things are tough. Those are the ones that I found you just naturally end up pouring into each other, and then the friendship relationship lasts a lot longer.
So one of the things that I think is important in that is asking the question, is this a season for them, or is this the basis of our relationship? If the season, every time they're calling, they're needing something, if that's the consistent theme, that's different than they're having a hard period of time. The season is tough for them. Right. And I want to be there as a friend. So I just want to be clear of what I'm saying, that I'm not saying that was not a good relationship. I didn't get fed last week. That's not the same. If I feel more alive more times when I'm with them and we're in a tough period, that's called life. So the question is, do we do a fair assessment of that rather than falling into they're wanting too much from me? the season of that versus the tone of the whole relationship is, I think, what's important.
Yeah, absolutely. So pivoting a little bit more to the business side, and also you mentioned you've published quite a few books, which is awesome. For someone that has expertise but maybe hasn't built an audience yet, where should their focus be first? Do you think it's in the content, in the relationships, or creating offers, and then why?
The offers come after. You're asking the question, what is the message that I have? And so people with expertise, so going to a book, why isn't a book important for lots of people? Part of what we're doing is trying to establish some authority. And I'll just kind of point out that the first part of that word authority is author. And that goes way back, right? And so now there are many ways of getting a book out. And so if somebody wants to do that, it's certainly possible to do that. And so to back up, so I don't think the offer comes first, but what you do is build your audience as you're doing the writing. After, too many people wait until after, and then there's not anything there as you're creating a book. And the pace of writing a book can vary. I've known people who spent a decade on it. I've known people who've spent a week on it. And so, what it takes is yours, but those ideas that are going in are shareable pretty easily. For me, the process of writing is always clarifying. I'm more and more clear about what I'm talking about as I'm writing about it. And so putting out the pieces. I have several books that I wrote really as podcast episodes. I would do the episode. That was the meat of it. Then I would go write it out. Well, I just shared that with whoever's listening. Others, I've written articles and waited for the feedback. So that's doing a couple of things at the same time. It's allowing me to be creative in a way that is getting reflections back to me. It's building an audience, and it's letting me think through things in a different way. When I am trying to do a podcast episode or an article, it's a different mindset than it is when you're trying to do the book. And it's still sharing with other people. So sharing, absolutely important to start building the audience. The real work of it comes as you've got the book to ask the question, so what do I want for that audience? And that's one of the mistakes that authors make. They haven't thought of what's next. Where do I want to lead a reader?
Say someone has written a book and it's becoming more than just a book. What business models typically tend to grow naturally from writing a book? And then what's like a realistic first step towards monetization after they've published? So now they're looking to take that book and turn it into a business.
Yeah, so the book is the entry point, as I think we kind of made clear. And so then you've got the architecture of what we're going to build here. And there are lots of subcategories of the forms, but often when it's expertise, you're either providing a service.
Okay.
Or consulting in certain ways, or doing coaching/therapy, that kind of one-on-one help, or public speaking, or workshops, whether they're live or online. I mean, that we're kind of down to those 5 big categories. That's what content kind of naturally leads to. So, it can be very broad. So I have one person who was a real estate agent who wrote a book about how this person does real estate. Providing the service was them doing that work, seeing people and helping them find their home. And so that is providing a service, but also know somebody who their thing was about mortgages. They created a product to help get in the door for people who might want a mortgage. That's still the way they do it, the service. I've had therapists who wrote a book on their specialty, whatever they do, their method, coaches too. And that all fits into that personal one-on-one service. But here's where it's interesting. You start one place and you want to make sure you head in that direction. That doesn't mean there might not be other avenues down the way.
Okay.
That's what happened. So it was kind of an accident. When I wrote my first book, I just thought I was still going to be the therapist/coach in the office, and my book was going to be out there and I'd get some sales and that'd be nice. And then I started getting phone calls and I kept going, well, that's interesting. But that was all I thought. And then one day I went, wait, there's a business here. I'm actually able to coach people. And then I realized that there were questions that kept coming up. That became another course or another part of a course or another piece. And so we're taking in the signals that come our way from people who are reading. And that shouldn't determine what we do, but it can help shape it. There's a difference between the signals and the noise. So I'll just dive in with my piece of how I determined that. So this person called me a couple of months after my book was out, and it was an ebook. It was on the internet, and this was back when the phone would ring in my office. There was none on my hip. And so I went and answered it. And when I picked it up, I went, oh, was that a bad move? Is this person going to want just free coaching? He did want help, but not free coaching, wanted help, and told me how helpful the material had been, but he needed more. Hadn't crossed my mind that when someone read the book, they would want more. But if the book means something to you, you'll want more. And so that was a signal to me to add on. Signal. Noise, though. I started getting emails from people going, could you teach us, it was a therapist, to use your material in our practice? And I was like, I got like maybe 6 or 7 in a short amount of time. And I thought, well, maybe I should do that. That'd be something to do. So I played with it a little bit and I thought, do I want to have people using my name, my approach without me having anything to do with how they did it and how it actually came off? No. Do I want a liability issue? No. That was noise, but it took me sitting with it to realize that was noise. Now, that doesn't mean that's always noise. I have a good friend who that's what she did. She took her material and she certifies people to use her material. That's her whole thing. And she loves doing that. That for her was signal. For me, it was noise.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. As you bring that up, it relates to a lot of different areas too in business and in marketing, and just hearing your conversation about listening to your audience. I think we often forget that when you're book writing, that because of social media and because of being able to connect with the community online, you can get that feedback. Even when I'm recording a podcast, if I'm recording a solo episode, sometimes it takes me just saying it out loud to realize what I'm saying and then to kind of brainstorm or think up some more ideas. Or if I'm talking to a friend about a podcast episode or a concept, it helps to kind of take a step back, and then I enjoy hearing other people's perspectives of what I'm talking about. So I think getting that feedback as you're starting to grow something is really helpful. And whether it's a book, whether it's a business, whether it's even just like an idea or a new feature for your business, having to take your audience along with you for the journey, or to take your friends and family with you, I think is so valuable, because then people also feel connected to you in a different way too. Like you said, some people kind of wait till the end where everything's polished and it's, packaged with a bow. And at that point, nobody really knows the behind the scenes of it, and they haven't been a part of the journey. So now you're kind of putting something out there that has to be explained again. So I think sharing that story is really important. I also feel like when you write a book too, or produce any sort of like long form content, I think about that with podcasting. I also think about it with like watching really long videos on YouTube. It adds like a layer of credibility to who you're listening to. Right now, it's really easy to scroll social media and forget what you saw. Just honestly, that's kind of how it is. Like, content is so short now. That when I listen to a podcast, I feel like I know the person a lot more, and they're able to provide a lot more value to me. So I feel like having a book, any sort of long form content, can really help you connect with your audience in a way that a lot of short form content really can't. And I really like that you mentioned too, adapting to different ideas, whether it be a signal or a noise. I think so many opportunities can come from putting yourself out there, whether it's in a book or online or however you want to do it. But to be conscious of those opportunities that come through. One thing I've talked a lot about on this show, especially for creators, is maybe your account starts to take off, which is great, but all these brands that are reaching out to you, how are you defining what brands you're going to work with? How are you going to keep that trust with your audience that you spent so much time building, and really determining between that signal and that noise? It's a really great way to put it. So from everything you've learned through coaching and research, what is the smallest change that tends to create the biggest ripple effect in one person's life?
So let's talk about it in particular around what we've been talking about with experts and expertise. And so the big change, the big thing, which starts with a small thing, is being clear about your framework, how you do it, because that plays out into everything you'll do. I've read plenty of books where, as I'm talking with the person, I'll say, oh, it sounds like you're doing X, Y, Z. And they'll go, I've never thought of it that way. They didn't identify their framework. I see the frameworks because that's what I look for. And that's what I tend to, it's kind of my little superpower of finding the framework in there. And sometimes the author is too close to it to see it, so they miss that framework. But being able to identify that means, first, you have a clear path of what you do. Second, you can be clear about it with people to let them know what you do. And third, it forms how you're going to go about building that business. So just that identifying the framework, that's a powerful exercise for anyone to go, what is my thumbprint? How do I particularly do it? And we all have it. At the beginning of people's work, they often are using the framework that was taught to them somewhere. But along the way, they add to it, they subtract from it, they do it their own unique way, and it becomes their framework once they hit that point. And that's usually the point when somebody's capable of writing a book that shows a difference for people than what's already out there.
Okay, so do you think the framework piece is the first place to start, and before starting to write? Because it sounds like some people weren't aware of what they're creating after they've created it.
That is correct. No, so you can't always start with that.
Okay.
Sometimes the framework emerges as you're working and as you're writing. So I would say that the real thing to start with is an awareness that there is a framework. There's
Okay.
always a framework. Well, that's not true. There's always a framework in a powerful book. I've read some
Okay.
books that meandered left and right, and there's not a lot in there. But a book that is powerfully written has a framework in there. When people say to me, "Oh, I want this book for everyone," it's kind of like your thing earlier about that. It's not for anyone. You really have to be clear about who this is for, and the framework helps to determine that. But for plenty of people, you start with writing and then go back and say, "Oh, there's my framework," and now that's a rewrite. Now you want to clarify it. For some people, they go, "I know exactly what I'm going to do," because
Okay.
they've thought it through. So can you think it through on the front side? Yes. Should you be thinking about it as you write? Yes. Is it possible you'll get to the end and still not be clear and somebody else have to point it out? Yes, but the framework is still what gives it power.
Before we close, where can our listeners find you and continue learning from your work? And if someone is maybe ready for a change and they're not sure where to begin, what would you want them to remember from today's conversation?
Yeah, so we all have our systems in place, and that means we get to change our systems. Our systems are what create our habits. And so I'm always asking the question. Many times I'll have people who say, "I don't have a system." And my response is, that is a system. It's just not a particularly effective one. So being clear about the systems in place that get you dealing with relationships or health or whatever it is, to have those in place are important. Getting in touch with me, especially for authors, that would be at booktobusinessblueprint.com, book to business blueprint, because we're helping people move from that book to a business. So booktobusinessblueprint.com. If people are interested in thriving, my Thriveology podcast is still out. I'm not actively doing that, but you can find that at Thriveology. So THRIVE-ology.
Awesome. And I'll add those links in the show notes for sure. But Dr. Lee, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your insights and your real perspective. I really appreciate it. I think my audience is going to learn a lot from this conversation. That wraps up another episode of Branding with Bex, your go-to space for insights, strategies, and inspiration to help you grow your personal brand, build your business, or turn your ideas into impact. A huge thank you to Dr. Lee for sharing his expertise today. You can connect with him and explore his work in the show notes. If this episode gave you a takeaway or sparked an idea, take one small action today. Even tiny steps can create momentum that compounds over time. As always, if you're enjoying the show, subscribe so you never miss an episode and share it with someone who's building a brand or business too. Keep showing up, keep creating, and keep building your story.